the graduate program on architecture and urban planner. We are going to start our opening class bringing the speech Commoning and Participatory Process in Social Housing in France. That's going to be given by Professor Dr. Sabrina Bresson from ENSA Paris Val de Seine, from Paris, from the Department of Architecture and Housing Research Center. I'd like to extend my greetings to Professor Vincent Lohouki, who's with her here in Brazil. Professor Bresson is with us thanks to CAP Sprint UPM program as a visiting professor. And we want to thank for the opportunity. We'd like to greet all the coordinators and directors of this program, and we'd like to remind you that the visit by Professor Bresson reiterates and honors the excellence of the postgraduate program in architecture and urban planning of Mackenzie, and a program that has the score 6 in CAPES, and these activities will help us achieve a higher score. I'd like to thank the authorities who are here with us today, Professor Dr. Felipe Chiarello, Prorector of Graduate Studies and Research, who represents Professor Dr. Marco Túlio de Castro Vasconcelos, the Dean of Mackenzie Presbyterian University. Our University Chaplain, Reverend Dr. Gildásio Jesus Barbeira dos Reis, who represents our Chancellor from Mackenzie, Reverend Dr. Robinson Grangeiro Monteiro. We also want to thank the other Professor Maria Isabel Villaco, who's organizing the activities related to the visit by Professor Bresson. We want to thank all of you who are here with us, coordinators, directors, students who are here with us in person and who are watching us on YouTube through TV Mackenzie channel or the channel for the postgraduate studies. First, we're going to start with Reverend Dr. Gildásio Jesus Barbosa dos Reis. We are a confessional institution, so we are going to start with a reflection. Dear all, good evening to all of you. Good evening to the members of our panel. The person who is sharing the panel, who's conducting the activities, Professor Felipe Chiarello, who is here with us. And I bring you the greetings from our Reverend Robson Grangeiro, and I want to greet our speaker, Professor Sabrina Bresson, and I want to welcome each and every one of you today. I was thinking on what biblical text I could share with you. Regarding what we're going to do today.
Proverbs 31, verbs 8 and 9 are good texts for us to have now. The wise said, "Open your mouth in favor for those that cannot defend themselves. Be the protector of the rights of all of those who are outcast. Raise your voice and rule with justice. Defend the poor and the outcast." The Solomon, the wise, is here looking at the reality of his time when people in need, without the favor of society, needed someone them that could help them. Thinking about our topic, trying to link here with our topic tonight, thinking obviously about the Brazilian reality, not the French reality, which I don't know, but thinking about our reality and the 39 municipalities that we have in the metropolitan area of São Paulo, we have today 750,000 areas, houses in areas in risk, running the risk of crumbling, landsliding, 750,000 households. So this is a very critical condition. According to the statement, according to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, every individual has the right to a standard of living enough to assure the individual and its family health, well-being, and especially well-being regarding food, housing, health assistance. So we have to think about urban areas that are at risk and think that the architects, this science that is so important for the urban reality, and think their architecture, the architects, they can, with the knowledge they have, somehow use it to help improve the standard of living, the quality of life of our city, especially thinking about housing. When we talk about a worth housing, something that affects lots of families, and it's one of the greatest problems that we have in the reality of São Paulo and that our country obviously goes through. Thinking about that, I understand that this text, this scripture, is a scripture that stands out to our eyes. When architecture work, looking at that reality, that critical reality, that housing deficit, houses that are in these risk areas, and that architecture can somehow contribute to improve the quality of life and turn and make the houses safer, better for those that live there so that they can have a better life. I believe that every effort, whichever the science, human science may be, and today thinking of architecture, every effort that we do towards improving the quality of life of individuals, especially thinking about housing. And I think that somehow this is meeting what Solomon mentioned to us. Open your mouth and towards those that cannot defend themselves, and be the protector of the rights of all of those who are outcast. How many of those that live in these risk areas that do not have the power, the means, the technical means, financial means, or any type of hindrance that they cannot respond to it, improve, work towards improving those regions in our city, in our country? I believe that the Holy Scripture brings a reference that is very certain that we have to look at those areas, we have to look at this reality, not only in our countries, but in other countries as well, where we have similar conditions to the ones we have here. I think that the Holy Scripture authorizes us to look at the reality and think about helping those individuals, assisting those in that situation, so that God may bless this gathering, that God may bless the reflection that we have here, so that they bring information, insights, and somehow guidance that will help us look at this reality and provide improvement for life, quality of life for those individuals. Our FAO and our post-graduation, once again, I want to congratulate them for its organization and this event, for the debate that will be carried out today, and the ideas that will be debated here. That God may bless you. That's my desire and my prayer in favor of this event. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Reverend. And we'll move on to the greetings by Professor Felipe Chiarello, our Pro-Rector of Research and Graduate Studies, representing our Dean, Professor Marco Túlio de Castro Vasconcelos. It is a pleasure to be here representing our Dean. I want to greet our speaker for today, Professor Dr. Sabrina Bresson, and say that it's an honor and a great joy to have you here with us. We want to thank you for speaking to us and for all the importance it brings to our university in our fight for dignity for people. It's part of the values of our university. I really wish our dean was here with us. He shares all these values. And the other day we were together. We were talking about that. And right before we started, we were talking about the actual cities we wish to have in our country. And what we are going to hear from Professor Sabrina is really going to be essential for the internationalization process in the print program. We are one of the first universities to receive that, and that's extremely important for the graduate studies, the undergraduate studies. And in my view, we should have gotten a score 7 in the last assessment, but it's an additional challenge for this brilliant program so we can show more and more all we have to offer. Our architecture and urban planning course is a very important course. We see every day the impact we have in the society, and the research done in the graduate studies, it's extremely important. I think the approach of Professor Sabrina Bresson is fantastic, considering her thesis for 2010 in concerning social housing and what she mentions in her articles concerning collaborative housing in magazines. It's a great honor and joy to receive your collaboration here. I was talking to the professor, and she says that she doesn't actually live in Paris, although her scientific production and interventions are done in the University of Paris. I believe she also has small kids. I have 3 daughters. And my middle daughter loves France, and she wants to study in Paris. It's her dream. And I think most of us would share this dream with us. And I always remember her. Her name is Manu. She loves poetry and she loves Paris, which are things that I also love. And I think that your speech represents also a labor of love. And I want to finish trying to do my best to represent our Dean, Marco Túlio, talking about the Brazilian poetry. It's an excerpt of an Olavo Bilac poem representing my daughter, Manuela, who would like to be here and go to Paris. And he says Olavo Bilac fell in love and wrote 36 love sonnets. And I dreamed that I was in love, and by seeing you, everything led me to you. And I heard my my steps through the grass, I heard the birds speaking, and they said, "Wait, and I'll follow." I want to kiss her cheeks, smell her, and approach her. And by being close, you can hear and you can see her. Being close, you can see the lights and the stars. The light shine, the moon shines, and happy or sad, I look for her in the skies. And then I say, what's the sense and everything that says? And I'm going to say, love to understand her, because only those who love can hear, see, and understand the stars. Thank you. Thank you, Professor. I want to thank everybody for being here. We're not receiving the sound phone without the microphone. Now it's working. Thank you. We want to thank all the authorities who are here for your kind works. We want to welcome Professor Sabrina Bresson, who's here with us. And I thank the authorities for being here, but please feel free to leave if you have other commitments. And I want to invite Professor Maria Isabel Villacchi to come up here and introduce Professor Sabrina and conduct our actions for today. And after the speech, we'll have questions and answers in our debate. So, Professor Maria Isabel, please. Good evening, everyone. Dear Karina, dear students, I took the microphone abruptly because I want to explain to all of you the long journey that brought us here today. We have a cooperation with the university, with Paris Valdecen since 2008. We have a cooperation that is very fruitful. We have students who go over there, others who come. And since in 2017, this cooperation changed thanks to Professor Sabrina. I had the pleasure of meeting her when I was doing my research in London, but I conducted a seminar with Professor Lester DiBiase in France, and I met Sabrina. Since then, we were able to get her to bring some students. We sent students over there, and they're doing some undergraduate studies there. We have organized a research seminar there with Carlos Leite, Cândido. We were all there with Professor Sabrina. That's why I took the liberty of speaking right now, because in addition to having her here, she's a partner with all the debates and dialogues between France and Brazil that we are organizing for June 30. And it's you can apply and enroll until March, and you can present or bring your work until March 10th, so you're all invited. Could you hear me? Well, now it's better. So until March 10, the France-Brazil dialogue is part of the internationalization process for the graduate studies. I was a founder in 2010. I was a professor of the urban planning studies in Paris. We had the first there. We had the second in 2012 here in Mackenzie, and we are in the 7th edition. The last one was in São Carlos. It was fully remote, and it was boring. But Sabrina participated, though we didn't have, she didn't need a ticket to participate. So I apologize for interrupting here, but I want to invite you all to participate. Eva is going to send you the call for papers. I have sent it to our new research coordinator, and thank you for being here. Congratulations to all of you, Belle, Sabrina, for such a happy occasion. And welcome all the students. This is an opening class, so welcome. Thank you, Nadia, for your words. So I give the floor to Maria Isabel, who's going to give a better introduction to Professor Sabrina. Okay, Eunice already talked a little bit about Sabrina. She's a professor at Paris Valdecine. She's also a researcher focused on social housing mainly, and in her extended work, she absorbs and debates the title that she brought to us today. And though she's talking about social housing, I'd say that what we really have in common, and to that sense, it's the third time we're conducting some work together, the matters related to common and shared spaces and participatory processes. So I think it's good to mention that Professor Vincent and Professor Sabina Bresson are here. We'll be conducting a design and small construction workshop at Paraisópolis with participation from the population. We are through the design phase, and after Carnival, those of you who are still alive, we're going to bring our constructions to place them in collective and public areas in the neighborhood of Paraisópolis with the participation of the people who live there. So I'd say that this debate is one of the main things, the nicest things we have in common, all these workshops that we're doing. So Sabrina, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you and to be here with you.
Welcome. Also, you have it.
Is it okay if I put it like that? You hear me?
Yes.
Sorry. Thank you very much. First, I want to thank you, of course, Frau Mackenzie and the international program CAPESPRIN for giving me the opportunity to be an inviting professor here in Mackenzie and also to be here with you tonight. And of course, I want to give a special thanks to Nadia and Isabel because she's my main contact and very nice partner during all this year. So I'm very glad to be here. Before I start, I just want to remind you that I'm not an architect. Maybe you didn't tell that in the presentation. I'm a sociologist teaching in a school of architecture. It's important to know because I'm not going to talk directly about design or architectural forms, but about daily practices, lifestyles, and social relationships. Of course, it is very connected, and in my research work, I try to analyze the link between what Henri Lefebvre calls design spaces, perceived spaces, and lived spaces. My main objective is to understand how people appropriate the space and in somehow how they transform the space. It is my way to enlighten the housing issues. And I've been working about social housing in France since my PhD, and even before when I was a student. And in recent years, I have focused my research on experiences of what I call community organizing, in which it's not a, yeah, it's better. Is it better like that? Okay. So, yes, community organizing in which residents take part in the design and in the management of their housing. And in this kind of housing project, the collective dimension and the idea of self-management or self-organization are very important. That's why I entitled my presentation, Commoning, Sharing Spaces and Participatory Process. I want to point the very important role of the group of residents in this project. Commoning first, of course, in reference of the theory of the commons of Olinor Ohlstrom, but also to say doing things together. So to talk about group activities, practices of mutualization, solidarity, mutual aid. Sharing spaces also, because in this project, housing is not only thought in terms of private spaces, there is a strong reflection about spaces that the residents can share on a daily basis. And participatory process, because it's very important to know that in this kind of project, the decisions are made collectively by the residents. So maybe when I talk about community organizing or self-management, some images come to you from your Brazilian standpoint, but the French context is very different and the comparison is impossible because the experiences I'm talking about, even if they are carried out by the residents, they are still very highly regulated by the institution and by the law. So the context is very different. Nevertheless, it doesn't mean these projects are mainstream in France. They are not at all. These projects, because they give an important place to the residents' decision-making, unable to think a better way, to think in a better way, sorry, the collective dimension of housing, which is often missing in social housing projects in France. So in a way, these projects are kind of counter-model to the French housing system. That's why I'm going to explain in the first section of my presentation the historical origin of this kind of project. So I will make a kind of socio-historical overview of this project to qualify them a little bit more. And after that, if I have enough time, I don't know, I will focus on a case study, a housing building which is very famous, well known for its architecture, but less for the social life inside. So the idea with this case study is to question the long-term perspective and the social evolution in this building. I can say now that the building is the one built by Le Corbusier next to Nantes. Okay. Sorry. So in the introduction, I have tried to define what kinds of housing project I'm talking about, but you have probably noticed that I have no words to qualify them, because it's a kind of nebula that can refer to different experiences. For instance, what we call in France cooperative housing or participatory housing or intentional communities. So it's very difficult to find the right word to qualify these very different kind of experiences, and sometimes I use the generic term of alternative housing to point that they are counter models or they are apart from the housing system, but it's not so much adequate. So what you have to understand is that these projects have two things in common: the collective dimension I have just mentioned before, and also the fact that these projects are developing within the framework of social housing. Of course, I don't have time now to develop on social housing system in France, which is very wide and complex, but just keep in mind that I'm talking about social housing in a broad sense, in reference to what Jean-Paul Flamand called le logement du peuple, housing for people. That is to say, for a significant part of the population, from the poorest one to the middle class. So this experience of alternative housing are not new. That's why I propose a kind of chronology of these experiences to question the social context of productions of these experiences of what I call alternative housing. I'm going in detail for each period. The origin of this experience can be probably traced back to the workers' cooperative of the late 19th century, of what we sometimes call socialist utopias. The most famous example in France is the Familistère de Guise. So you can see the photo in the north of France. It was built by an industrialist called Jean-Baptiste Gaudin, who had been converted to the ideas of the philosopher Charles Fournier, the French philosopher whose work was in favor of cooperation and association. And so he built this building in 1857 near his factory, and it is opened up onto an inner courtyard. You can see the photo on the screen, that he imagined as a place for community life, for meeting and sharing activity. There are also different integrated collective services in the Familistère, like a theater, a school, a nursery, a laundry, a swimming pool, and also local stores. And also there is a complete social welfare system based on mutuality. And all of this was managed by a housing cooperative association led by the resident. So of course the project is to provide access to culture, education, health to the residents, but also the idea is to give them the condition of their emancipation. So this is a very interesting project, which still exists, but is kind of museum now. The second period, I call it the time of emergency. It's about the experience of the cooperative movement after World War II. The French historian called Roger-Henri Guérand showed that the development of housing cooperatives emerged alongside the birth of social housing in France at the beginning of the 20th century. First, to address the lack of housing for the working classes, and then after World War II, to participate in the reconstruction process, but in its own way. So in this period, the cooperative movement proposed alternative to large-scale, high-rise housing projects, which were promoted by the government in this period. And two approaches are very interesting. The one called the castor. In French, we say the castor, the animal, the beaver, and the social housing cooperative, which both became, in this period, atypical actors of the housing production. So you have a photo here of the castor. Just a few words about the castor movement, because it gave shape to self-built cooperative based on the principle of labor contribution rather than financial contribution, in order to enable low-income people to finance the construction of their home by their collective work. So I think it's quite close to what you call in Brazil. It's different, but it can be linked to what you call in Brazil mutirão. The castor proposed a new model of cooperative action based on the capacity of the civil society to solve the deficit of housing on its own, but also to oppose again to the policy of large-scale collective housing project. For example, in this place where I made survey, you see it's individual houses, and most of the time the castor neighborhood are made with individual houses. There are not so many sharing spaces, but some collective services. For example, in this project, they also built the school for children. So, and this is interesting because even if there is not so many sharing spaces, we can say that this model initiates solidarity practices that go far beyond the construction of housing. And for example, they still have, there still is mutual aid in this neighborhood, and all the people know each other and so on. So still in the same period, I can say a few words about the cooperative rental housing. This is social housing cooperative, and you can see the building of Le Corbusier, which it's not known, but this building next to Nantes, the one next to Nantes, was made by a social housing cooperative. And this model of cooperative rental housing created the status of intermediate occupancy between ordinary renting and home ownership, which can be considered as a collective property regime. And again, in this period, it was very different of the mainstream housing policy. But unfortunately, this model had been stopped in 1971 by the Chalandon law, which was in favor of home ownership. But after World War II, we have a few remarkable examples of social housing cooperative like this one, but also like this one, which is the Sillon de Bretagne, always next to Nantes, which is also a building with different sharing spaces, and which has been renewed a few years ago. But I'm going to talk about Le Corbusier in detail after that. The next period, I call it the time of protest. It's the period of urban struggles in the 70s. It is a bit a step aside because we are not longer on the scale of housing here, but much more on the urban scale. And these experiences of urban struggles were born in the context of the failure of post-war housing policies, and also in the context of the contestation of May 1968. So these experiences are probably the first experiences of what we call today participatory urbanism, but in a bottom-up way. And in this period emerged what we call in France ateliers populaires d'urbanisme, popular urban planning workshops, which were questioning the technocratic production of the city, in reference, of course, to the Marxist sociology of this period and to Henri Lefebvre, droit à la ville, right to the city. And I just wanted to show you two interesting examples. The first one is this one. It is the neighborhood of Almagar in Roubaix, in the north of France. And there was a huge urban renewal project, which was contested by the residents, who proposed a counter-project with the help of some activists, architects, and sociologists. They proposed this, they call it la carte projet, the map project, and they proposed a counter-project. It took a very long time, but at the end they won. So it was very positive and very well-known experience. Another one, which is maybe not very well known. It's in the neighborhood called Les Béalières in Mélan. It's near Grenoble. And the municipality, it was a left-wing municipality, had the idea to organize a huge popular planning workshop to create a new neighborhood. And this workshop leads to one of the first experiences of participatory housing. So, oops. Sorry. So on the screen you can see three different buildings which were all designed with the inhabitants. And there are self-managed social housing, which are still existing today. So with different kind of sharing spaces. The next period is the period of the 70s and until the 90s. I call it the time of the suburban dream. Actually, we said le rêve pavillonnaire in French. I don't know how to translate that. It's a very French thing, so I'm trying to translate by suburban dream. But from the 70s to the 90s, there are not many new experiences of this kind of project, because this is a period of very strong proactive policy in favor of access to home ownership. So this is the time of the development of individual houses in the suburb. Everybody wants is individual houses. So collective initiatives are rare at this time, but there is a few experiences of what we call mouvement pour l'habitat groupé autogéré, the self-managed cluster housing movement. There are very small projects, often around 10 families. 10 families who put their money together to self-build and to self-manage their home. So these projects are very few in number, and they concern more the middle classes, I would say, but they are going to inspire the revival of what is now called in France participatory housing. And so on the photo you can see an experience called Anagram next to Lille in the north of France. So there is 10 apartments in this big house, and they share different common spaces in the garden, of course, but also some place just to meet. They also have a spare room for the guests. They also have a place with where the children can play, and doesn't matter, and a garden. So I've just said this kind of experience during the 80s and the 90s, they inspire the participatory housing, and that's the last period I wanted to talk about. I call it the time of recomposition. It's about participatory housing and new participatory process in social housing, because in the very recent period, after 2000, emerged new experiences of self-promoted and self-managed housing projects. The pioneer experiences concern also small groups of residents, often activists, who have difficulty to make their projects succeed because there is no institutional framework. But after years of mobilization, they managed to obtain a legislative recognition with the Allure law, which define participatory housing. So I put an extract of the Allure law, and you have to know that there are three main ideas in this law. The idea of sharing spaces and mutualization and commoning, the idea of participation, and also ecological values. And so this experiment, this project, of course, they still remain on the fringe, but they have given a new impetus to certain social landlords, not all of them, of course, but some social housing organizations now are taking inspiration from this project for their housing programs in order to involve the residents. So I have a few examples now. This one is a very pioneer experience of participatory housing, so always quite small scale, maybe 12 families, yes, who share this building. They share their garden. They also share common local for different activities of the group. They have a workshop in common. They have a laundry. And all the balconies are open, so you can talk to your neighbor and go to see your neighbor when you want. Sorry. This one, I don't know why the photo is like that. This one is Callisto in Toulouse. It's very interesting because it is one of the very first experience managed by a social landlord who involve the residents in the design of the building. And so the resident could choose the way their apartment will be, and also different common spaces. This one is very interesting. It's an experience in Montreuil, next to Paris. It is called Le Nouveau Centenaire, and it's also an experience of a social landlords who involve a community of African people who were living in a squat in a very precarious condition, and they were involving in the design and in the management of the building they are now living in. There are also experiences for elderly people, where elderly people can think together in a collective way to the place they want to live for their retirement. So it is often said that it's a kind of alternative to the retirement home. Oops, I'm sorry. And also there are lots of new experiences in social housing of the landlords try to make common local for the people to organize activities, sharing activities, and of course there are lots of experiences of shared gardens. Sorry. And also there are new models of collaborative rental management in the social housing sector. I'm going a bit fast because I'm looking at the time. So this overview, this quite fast overview, leads me to several remarks or questions. You can see that these experiences take place in context of housing crisis. I think it's a very important point because these experiences all point the issue of access to housing. And also, it's interesting because along the time we observe the shift from the working class housing issue to the question of how access to housing for the middle classes, because the new experiences are much more oriented or managed by the middle classes. So it leads me to a few questions. How these experiences of sharing or commoning put into practice on a daily basis, and how do group of inhabitants and collaborative principles withstand time? What are the drivers of change? How they evaluate with time? And to answer this question, I propose a short focus on Le Corbusier's building. I talked about it just before, but I can say a little bit more about this building because I know it very well, because I begin to work and to survey in this building for my PhD. So I'm using a monographic approach here based on empirical data collected since 2004, first part of my PhD, but even before when I was a student. And so I'm updating the data on a regular basis. I carried many interviews with the resident and observation during meetings and during my visits and during different events. And I also used the specific data collection methods to trace the social history of the building over the last 60 or 70 years, including an interview with the first residents, and I found in the archive of a sociologist called Chambard-Delot, who made survey at the beginning of the building in 1955. So the Maison Radieuse, you probably know this building. This one is in Rezé. It's a small town near to Nantes. It was the second unité d'habitation built by Le Corbusier in France. And it was built, I told you that before, by a local social housing cooperative. So its history and its trajectory are very unique because they are different from the architect's other housing project due to this cooperative status. And so the residents until 1971 were not tenants, they were not owners, they were members of the cooperative. So they were co-owners of the cooperative's shares. But I told you before about the Chalandon law in 1971. It forced the resident to choose between social housing, rental, or co-ownership. So today the building is mixed. There are 60% of social housing tenants and 40% of co-owners. And it's not a detail, but it's important to know that the Maison Radieuse has been classified as an historical monument in 1965. Of course, in addition to this cooperative status, the specificity of this building is that it has many common spaces. And the original resident we met said that they felt they had shared a unique experience, and they say they have the idea that each person took part in the community life and constitute an integral piece of a greater thing. And this feeling of sharing things has influenced a lot the way they appropriate the shared spaces. So that I'm going to show you the shared spaces. There is a huge park with trees and playground. There are shops in the hall, a post office, a newspaper kiosk. There is a shared delivery system that allows the inhabitants to have fresh produce, milk, meat, and bread delivered every morning by the shopkeepers of the town directly in this small box you can see next to the doors. It's kind of locker, and so they can be delivered in this locker. There is also a preschool on the roof terrace. So you can see photos of the school on the terrace, on the roof. And there are available spaces for the residents' association so they can appropriate like they want. For example, here on the different upper floors, here they have a kind of gym a place for sport, self-organized. Here, a library for the children, always self-organized. So in the early years, the excitement of the post-war boom, the predisposition of the inhabitants to collective action, and the high degree of social homogeneity in these years favored the appropriation of this space shared. The park, for example, was an important place for collective life. The rooftop also constituted a meeting place in the early year, which was very important for the sociability of women and children in the building. The shops were very useful to facilitate everyday life. So it was a very enthusiastic period. Oh, sorry. But after the 70s, with the end of the cooperative status and the beginning of the economic recession in France, a new population of lower income tenants arrived at the Maison Radieuse, and in a context that was less open to collective involvement. So the park stopped to be a meeting place. It even became a place of conflict. The number of children decreased in the building, so the school has been threatened several times to be closed. The local services and the shops in the Maison Radieuse no longer got the same support and were even forced to close. So from the end of the 70s to the years 2000. It is a period of the evaluation of the building and also the evaluation of the community life. But in the recent year, the shared spaces are reinvested by a new wave of residents. And it's interesting because more than 60 years, nearly 70 years after its creation, after this period of disaffection, it is now being revitalized by young people who identify with the original cooperative values. So they update these values around questions which are very different from the question of the 50s or the 60s. They reactualize the cooperative values around the idea of the question of environment, proximity, commoning, and mutual aid in an uncertain social economic context. So, for example, there was a strong, very important struggle when the post office decided to close, because the people said, of course, it was a service which was disappeared, but it was also a way. It was also a way to. Sorry, I forgot the word in English. To porter atteinte, sorry, to the heritage, the heritage of Le Corbusier. This new, in the recent years, there are also new initiatives to make the collective, the common spaces, to make them active again. And for example, some inhabitants try to organize common activities and activities for the children in this local, which used to be the kiosk, the journal kiosk. And of course, the park is now a very interesting place, because the new inhabitants, the new residents are very likes the park very much in the context which is now very urbanized in Nantes, and they like the park very much, so they use again the park, and they have created some shared gardens. Yes, another photo of the shared gardens. So I should stop, I think, now. And so to conclude, I just want to say that, is that good? Yeah? Yeah. So to conclude, I just want to tell you that, you see, the long-time perspective is very important in my analysis, and it reveals different phases of engagement and disengagement from community life at the Maison Radieuse, which are combined with forms of appropriation and disappropriation of shared spaces. So we can say that the uses and sociability built around the community facilities of the Maison Radieuse are indicators of commoning and community life and cooperative spirit, and they are related to the social context, because you can see when the context is enthusiastic, when the economic context is enthusiastic, the people are involved in the community life, and when it's less enthusiastic, it's more difficult. But in the recent year, it's very interesting, because the common spaces the shared spaces are renewed around new issues which are very specific of the context, around the issue of environment. A lot of initiatives are oriented on environment issue. That's also why I try to show you with the historical overview that the architecture is very important, but common spaces are also very related to the social context. So thank you.
Obrigada, professor.
Thank you, Professor Sabrina. I'd like to invite Professora Nadia and Marisabel to start our debate and also inform or pass on everyone greetings from our professor from the architecture school that is not here present physically, but she is watching us. So she extends her greetings to all of us, Professor Sabrina and our visitors. I'd like to thank Professor Sabrina, and I'd like to make a few comments that may be useful to our new students. I think this is the most interesting thing. What Sabrina has shown us is something that we want that you do in your research. So she gives examples of research that are very interesting, and she shows something that we really like, which is timeline. Timeline, for those who have been my students, know that this is very important. That timeline that Sabrina brings to us and shows us within a perspective where we include contexts, economical contexts, transforming contexts, not just housing policies in an economic context. So she didn't go into details, but a context of a transformation of the working class. So it's not explicit, but she shows how the transformation and the engagement happens within that transformation perspective, social, economic, and of the working class. What we see is that there is a housing policy. And what we can think about the cooperative models have to do with the land owning aspects. The location for the housing projects has to do with the prices for the lands, which are becoming more and more expensive. Sabrina herself doesn't live in Paris because it's expensive for the working class to be. So I ask, if the examples for cooperation and engagement by population have to do with this differentiation in land owning. This is one point. But also, I'd like to mention a few things. She shows that in its base, there is housing policies. We know that apart from everything, in France, we have that. We have there a housing policy there. And I see here, I'm very happy to be here because I met one of our students in person today that I had never met in person before. And I'd like to say that Stefania, who is here today, she did an exercise in my discipline about the non-existence of a housing policy in Brazil. So this is a comparison, not that we're going to compare here, but I'd like to thank her because she showed me, according to what she researched, that we don't have that perspective, but we do have the population engagement. And I think that this is something important because we see the squatting, occupation, historical centers, and we talk about the co-production of the space. We have examples of cooperation and involvement by the population in our squatting. So if she see any relation between the engagement of the population in France and the examples that she's been learning about in Paraisópolis and in the squatting sites. And the third point, which is more broad, about the contemporary transformations, the movements that we see now in Paris, about previdence reform, if this affects Social Security reform, if this affects the population. And I'm the president of the Council for Architecture and Urbanism. I want to say that we conducted a census with the architects. I think the majority here are architects. Ana is not an architect. Well, the architects have little involvement or engagement in our architecture entities. Only 15% of the architects are involved. And also, 65% of the architects earn up to 3 minimum wage salaries, 3 times the minimum wage. How can you pay your bills and also be socially involved?
Does this difference between the social security systems, the conditions of the workers, are they in any way related to what you have researched? This was not very clear for us. I want to clarify what I mean. I think what she shows in terms of cooperative has a very well-defined project from the beginning. Only in the later contemporary years, the project becomes a bit less, let's say, based on voluntary work. You don't have a name like Le Corbusier behind it. If our perspective for this collective work, like our mutirões, are related to that, is more something that I think it's not a question for you, it's more a reflection. The questions have to do with land property and how these examples that were researched are located, the issues related to the transformation of the working class and how this relates to their participation and engagement, and the fact that there is housing policy that is the basis of any of the examples that you brought. You don't have to answer all of this point by point. It's more a reflection I wanted to bring. And I want to tell our students that what is interesting is that she's presenting a very important methodology example, which is going to be very useful for all of you, and I want to thank Sabrina for that. So thank you.
No. Yes. Thank you, Nadia, for your remarks and your questions. Maybe first about the involvement in social housing in general, and maybe also the comparison with Brazil. I cannot say comparison, but the comparison is not possible. But still, you asked me about my experience, my current experience here in Paraísopolis, and maybe the kind of comparison I can make. It's a bit difficult because I've been very fast, but the example I presented to you, I surveyed them during a very long time, and I know Paraísopolis just last Monday. I don't remember which day we are. Last Monday, so it's a bit difficult to compare. But I'm going to talk about another example. I have the opportunity to visit here in São Paulo, and I'm looking to Karina during August when we came for the Copolis research program, and we have very interesting visit in occupation vertical, vertical occupation in the center of São Paulo, and we have the opportunity to meet people there, and I was very, very surprised by the fact that I found very similar way of organization from the ones I observe in participatory housing in France. it's very interesting because it's not the same context, it's not the same problem. The people who live in participatory housing in France are privileged compared to the people in the center of, in the occupation in the center of São Paulo. But still, the way of self-organization, of self-management, the way they just organized, I don't know, I remember there were big posters with, you know, a schedule to organize the everyday life. I found exactly the same thing in participatory housing. So the daily life is still the same, even if you are in the worst precarious situation or in a welfare place, not in Paris, because these people cannot live in Paris anymore, but elsewhere in France. So that's very interesting to see that the way of organization are still the same. For the other question you ask, and maybe about the transformation of working class, again, maybe I've been a bit fast, but the idea of my overview was to show you that it's not anymore a problem of the working class. Because in France, I think the working class doesn't exist anymore. We have more and more poor people and middle classes who used to be quite well protected and with no problem of access to housing, but today it's not true anymore. And middle classes have more and more problem to find a housing. So during the presentation, it's all that I don't live in Paris, for example, because it's not possible. We are outpriced of Paris. It's not possible. It's very, very expensive. So of course you can always find an apartment, but not always the apartment you would like, and not always in the location you would like. So it's very, very difficult. And now all these initiatives of self-design, self-management, they really question the issue of access to housing, not only for the poorest people, but also for the middle class. So that's why I think it's not a working class problem anymore. It's a wider problem. And just maybe to finish about your question, you also ask the evolution of involvement, engagement in housing. There are different sociologists who observe the change of engagement in general, not only about housing, and the organization like association, syndicat, union are not involved anymore. No, I mean, people are not involved in this kind of organization anymore, and we observe much more spontaneous engagement, which are focused on one thing. It's not long-term engagement anymore, but it is focused on a very specific thing. And for example, I can also mention the work of my colleagues in France in this program, in this Brazil-France program called Copolis, because they work in social housing and they work with inhabitants who contest the renewing or the transformation of the neighborhood. But they are engaged only during this period of conflicts. But what we observe is that we have less and less tenants association or housing associations who fight in a long-term perspective for the right to the housing, for the right to the city. So things are changing, but there are new forms of commitments which are also very interesting, and maybe which also leads to new, different kind of collaboration between the inhabitants and the expert of the city or of the housing. And for example, and this is what we are trying to do in a way, in somehow, in our workshop in Paraisopolis now, to involve the architect and the future architects in this movement, this inhabitant movement, and in this movement for the right to the city or the right to the housing.
Not sure I was there. Yes.
Can I ask a question? It's a short question. While you were showing, especially the biggest example of Le Corbusier, and how when you open or the beginning of the building, you had the privilege of the shared spaces that were included in the design. And then with time, things kind of cooled down, and recently people are recovering this desire for sharing spaces and collective spaces. That reminds me of the example of Rivry-Saint-Seine, where it seems to me that the architects created very interesting designs in terms of spaces in the apartments where you can see your neighbors, you can talk through, you can see the garden, you can see your neighbor through them, and you have collective and public spaces. And in a way, I see that this brings out the desire of recovering all this, because it gets to a point where these projects lose force and lose people. And I wanted to mention, and I think it would be nice for you if you could talk about it, about the importance of initiatives regarding participatory processes, calling architects that were proposed by the Communist Party in France. Is it too hard?
Yes, it's a huge question, but also I'm not sure of what I understood. You said participatory process initiated by the Communist Party? You said participatory housing? Yes, but no, it's not true. It was not at all a participatory process in Ivry. And yes, we have what we call in French la banlieue rouge, the red suburb around Paris, because there used to be communist municipalities, and it is true that communist municipalities around Paris worked a lot about social housing, and you have a lot of social housing. It's very important because I think still now, even if the municipalities are not communist anymore, but the social housing remain, we have still like 50 or 60% of social housing in this city, which is very important for Paris region, because some other cities don't want to have social housing because they don't want to have poor people, and so there is a law which is for the city, which are supposed to have at least 25% of social housing. But it's not true in all the... So in the communist municipalities, it is interesting because that's true. There are lots of experiences of social housing from the beginning of the 20th century, the very first social housing, to post-war housing, and to recent experiences. And this is interesting because most of the time they made competition for architects, and with very innovative way of thinking the housing. And this is the case for the building you were talking about in Ivry, from Jean Renaudy and René Gailloustet, which are two famous architects, French architects. but I wouldn't say there were a participatory process. But it is but yes, it's interesting, except maybe for one of the projects with the school, which is really integrated into the housing, the ensemble of housing. And so for this school, Jean Renaudy make kind of workshop with the teachers, the parents, and the children to imagine, to design the school. So except for this example, I think there was not a process of participation, but the both architects try to imagine places where people can meet. They can speak together in the garden, they can speak together in the pedestrian ways. So it's true that this kind of spaces allowed or reinforce sociability in this neighborhood, and also initiative of collective association and so on. So maybe in this case it was not a participatory process, but the quality of the space, maybe not all the architects would be agree with me, but I think the quality of the space allowed some interesting uses. But like in Le Corbusier, it's not a linear observation, because when the context is favorable, the sociability in this space is very enthusiastic. But when there are problems and when there are conflicts and when people have other concerns, the sociability, even if the space are very interesting, the sociability decreases. So yes, so this is why I compared this building in Ivry-sur-Seine and also Le Corbusier, because it's a very different architecture, but it has evolved in a bit in the same way because of the social context.
Pessoal, está aberto.
Everyone, the debate is open. So you can ask questions. Can I stay here? Good evening. I am Isabella. I am a student in the program. My question is about the relation of the changes brought by the pandemic. I believe impacted greatly the way people live, their relation with their homes. They stay longer home. Remote work has become more frequent. Many times people don't have that space to work inside their apartments. So if those initiatives, they end up leading to more space for people to work, and even for different relations that before didn't exist at home, and now there is that need.
It's a very interesting question. Because during the pandemic, it turns out that in this project, not all of them, but for example, a few of them I know, what I call participatory housing. In this project, the pandemic, I don't know how to say that, was easier for the people who live there because of the shared spaces, and because even if they don't have enough room in their private apartment to work or to for the children to play, etc., they organized the shared spaces for the people during the pandemic to have a kind of extension of their apartment. So there were a few articles, a few papers about the pandemic in this kind of project, and yes, it turns out that it was easier to live during the pandemic in this project. And also, I had the opportunity. I began a research program in different kind of social housing project just before the pandemic. And it was about what I call collaborative practices. And so the project was to survey the collective activities and so on, and different participatory process imagined by the social landlord and so on. But as it was the pandemic, nothing happened. But still, I managed to go there and to talk to the people. And again, it turns out that the different associations in this kind of project, which were more involved in mutual aid and things like that. I remember I met an association of old ladies who began at the very beginning of the pandemic. There wasn't enough masks in France, and they began to sew a lot of masks for the people of the building and so on. And it was and again it was because the association exists before, because there was a place they can meet and they can sew together. Sew, is it the right word? Sew together. And so, yes, it was very interesting to see that maybe this kind of project with more shared spaces and more people involved in the project are maybe better place to live when there are problems like that.
Hi, Sabrina. I'm Renata Coradin. I am professor, a doctoring here. Thanks for sharing your research with us. Very interesting. I'd like to know about the groups of residents in these cooperatives. If you were able to identify if there were a high number of women or initiatives by women, if we could say that, if we could talk a little bit about gender when we talk about those groups in the cooperatives. Good evening, Carlos Leite, professor here in the program. Comment ça va, Sabrina? Well, I have a short story connected to her question. For a few years, I've been developing this work in Jardim Colombo, which is a small favela right next to Paraisópolis, where you guys are working. And the leadership that usually works with me, there's a woman called Esther, and she has a very rare story and very beautiful. She was born in favela, 17 brothers, many died, that tragedy. She studied architecture, did post-graduation, has some beautiful work there, is a space, a public space there, and now she was just hired as a visiting professor for MIT. Last week I was with her. She was remodeling a bedroom for an individual to live there, a person that was moving in, 4 square meters, 4. Yes, Esther Carro. And Esther is always teasing me, and I want to pass on that teasing to you. She said, Carlos, professor, I can't believe that our graduation and post-graduation courses in Brazil do not put more female students to work and have applied research with us here. Because we, women, are here. For those who are in favelas in Brazil, those who are in the collective actions or mutirões are the women, predominantly, much more than men. You have her project. It's always almost women. So she's always provoking me, teasing me. Where are the female students? So I'd like to pass on. What about friends? How is it in students, male, female students? Are they doing those applied research work, beyond périphérique?
Thank you. It's also a very interesting question. And so about the women or the gender issues in this kind of project, I went very fast about the elderly project, participatory project, but there are female and feminist projects, and one of them called Les Baba Yagas, you know that? Les Baba Yagas next to Paris is a very activist project about elderly and women issues in housing. So we have most of the time the gender issues in this project. For the recent one, for this project, are related to the elderly issues. But I know, I haven't surveyed this example, but I know different examples in social housing about single mother. I haven't surveyed them, so I don't know really how it works, but I know there are very few in number, but I know there are a project about single mothers who doesn't live together, but who live in the same place, in the same building, and with maybe shared spaces, but I'm not sure of that. And so they can help each other with the children and so on. So I know this kind of project, but I also wanted to say that there are different studies, and for example, in the 80s or even in the 70s, in the 80s or in the 90s, I think of a study from the sociologist Susanna Magri. She wrote about women in social housing, and she showed that the housing issue and the domestic issue are always led by women. So that's also why probably when I surveyed in different project, most of the time when I asked for interviews, the women answered. And it's much more difficult to talk with the men, because I'm talking about housing issue, my question are, and also I'm a woman, probably also, it's also a question of methodology, but yes, I think the housing issues in general are women problems, and also in relation to the question about the pandemic. During the pandemic, I was talking about all this initiative of mutual aid, and most of the time they were initiated by women. So that's my answer about gender issues, and about the question, your question about the women students. And so, yes, it's a pity, because I'm just saying that housing issues are female issues, sorry, but it is true that we have more and more female students in School of Architecture in France. I think we have 60% of women students in our school in France in general. But if you look, if you look who are the professors in our school and who won competition and who are which architects have their own offices, the numbers are not the same. I don't have them in mind, but they are very, very different and very lower. So there is a kind of, there is what we call in French plafond de verre, but I don't know how to say that in English. The idea that there is a kind of, a limit for women. They cannot reach the the position of professor at the university, the position in architecture offices, and so that's a problem. Even if we have 60% of women who are students in our school.
Good evening. My name is Oscar. I'm starting my master's now, but in my professional life, I'm an architect. I've conducted at least 10 landscape projects in favelas, many different favelas. And the reality that we have in the slums here is actually those who organize the life in the favelas, in my experience, are the groups that, how can I say it? They are the drug lords or the owners of the drugs. That's what it is. So much so that for us to work in the favelas during the day, they open space for people to pass through, to go to work, to take pictures. There were orders like, hey, hold on. Then they would, send all the inspectors, all those that are part of the community. So then they would, squat, and then we could take the pictures. And at the end of the day, when work was done, the commitment was to close the entrances at the favelas with those New Jerseys, those concrete blocks, so that the police couldn't get in at night. So there was a very hostile, civilized relation. And then what happened in my experience as a landscaper, that all the spaces that I created with hope, with the structure, the framework that I had developed throughout my professional life, with spaces, with tables for games, even small basketballs, they were created. It was beautiful when it was over, and right after, the courts were sold for houses to be built. The toys that were made with iron, well, they pull all the metal to sell the metal. So I see that this reality is very different from what was proposed. Because the dominant class there is one that is not part of our reality. So those who are in university and think about people's well-being has a reference, something that is not part of their everyday life. So there's a conflict of realities that sometimes it seemed to me that I was projecting, designing for a public that didn't exist. And almost everything that was done was destroyed, and it looked like some crazy work. And I don't think that happens. I mean, I can see in the examples that that doesn't happen. The reality is very different. So how do you see this situation in the midst of everything that you mentioned?
Sorry, my voice is kind of faltering.
Yes, you're right. The contexts are very different, and there is no comparison between what you are talking about and the problem you are mentioning. We have some problems in France. If I'm to be honest, of course, we have also drugs problem and garbage problem in Marseille. You have seen that, and we have this kind of issue, but not in the same dimension of what you are talking about. And also but it's also an issue, because sometimes when I work with the students, they have lots of a priori stereotypes of this neighborhood, and they think the social housing in France, some neighborhood of social housing in France are very dangerous because of traffic and so on. And when I say, no, come on, we are going to go out from the school and to get there, to meet the people and so on, they can see that, okay, maybe there are some problems and there are some traffic and so on, but there are also many people who are engaged in the community life and try to make the neighborhood better. So I don't know, but what I've seen in Paraísopolis seems to be a bit the same. I mean, in another scale, but of course, probably there are many problems, but there are also a strong community life, and we met some students of the neighborhood, some young people of the neighborhood, but also some community leaders who make a great work with the residents, with the people there to make the neighborhood better, even if it's very hard, and even if I understand that sometimes when you are an architect or when you propose some furniture or some arrangement with the spaces, sometimes it doesn't work. But it's true in the poor neighborhood, and it's also true in other neighborhoods, because sometimes I'm in conflict with my colleagues who are architects, because I often say that to have a very good project, and for if you want the project to be appropriated by the people, you have to meet them, you have to be there, you have to talk to them, you have to be there quite a long time. And I know it's not possible, it's not always possible, but I believe that's also another way to make project, to involve the people in the project, in the design of the project. But I know even sometimes when you do that, it doesn't work. And even in France, where the context is maybe much more easier, I know many colleagues and young colleagues who try to be involved in this neighborhood and to propose some activity, furniture. I think of an example of young architects who try to propose furniture for the public spaces in the social housing, and it didn't work at all. The people, well, not really respected the furniture, but yeah, so I have no solution, of course.
Boa noite.
Good evening. I'm a PhD student here in Mackenzie. And my question is, how do you build and maintain the engagement from the group of residents who are at the locations? Here in Brazil, sometimes after a great struggle in urban planning areas, designs for some areas, you have a social technician who sometimes works together with the architect to try to form this group and create this collaboration. In Brazil, it doesn't work very well, but in some places, you have the best groups and the best engagements. It's where you end up having the best work. But that costs money, that takes time, and requires methodologies and techniques that are very specific. Do you have anything like that in France? If you do, who participates in it? Who pays for it? How does it work? Thank you.
When you say who participate on it, you mean the resident or the see? Yes. Yes. We also have, of course, I talk about what I call alternative projects. So they are very few in number. Most of the time they work, but they are not mainstream. And we have lots of other kind of participatory process, much more top-down. And most of the time, when it's very top-down, when it's decided by the architect or by the institution, it doesn't work very well, neither in France. Because I think we cannot decide, we cannot decide that the people should participate. So it's very difficult, and I don't have answer. And I know my colleagues and also people I meet in social housing neighborhoods, they always say the same. They say, we are trying, we are organizing things, but people don't come, and we don't manage to involve them in a long time perspective. We have more and more research about what we call sometimes facilitators in France, who can be professionals. So you're right, it costs money, and who pay for this work. I went a bit fast, but I show you an experience called Dear Neighbors, but I pass very fast, in social housing, and the landlords pay to have what they call an animator, a facilitator, to work with the people, to help them to organize themselves and so on. But the question is, do we really emancipate the people? Because if they always need a professional to be there, it's also a problem. And also because the facilitator in this case is paid by the social landlords. So if the people want to organize themselves, but in a way which is not, which doesn't fit with the social landlord's desire, it's a problem. So it doesn't work very well, but there are lots of research on this issue in France, and so there is a problem of money, of course, and you're right. There is also a problem of methodology, because I think there is no good recipe, and the methodology has to be thought with the context, with the people, and so on, and yes, and there are lots of questions about that in France, and maybe I can say that I'm very interested here in Brazil about what you call community leaders, because they are from the community, they are people living in this neighborhood, and I have the idea that is more efficient than professional or people who are coming from outside the neighborhood. And of course, we have also this kind of people in France, but it's funny because they don't call themselves community leaders. They don't even call themselves leaders. I mean, they are leaders. They are actually leaders, but I don't know why they don't want to assume this position. So it's very interesting for me to see that in Brazil. And I remember when we visited Occupation with Karina, we came with what we can call community leaders. You remember Fatima was a community leader, but she told me, I'm not a community leader. And she was a bit embarrassed with this notion. So yes, maybe this is something very specific in Brazil, but to me, in my French point of view, it's very interesting. I don't know if I answer very well your question, but...
Any other questions? Eunice? Anybody else wants to ask a question? I'm going to ask one then. When you enter a favela such as Paraisópolis, and we all do enter these areas as strangers, as foreigners. We are not from that place. Based on our education, we know that there is a culture of sharing, of community that is typical of this area. Maybe they really work much more with this sharing, with this community idea. They share the care for children, of the elderly. They have areas that are proper for that sharing. But there's also a question in these informal regions, that is the fact that they are pre-existence. Places such as Paraisópolis, Heliópolis, you cannot think of building new houses for them. You have to enter and try to work on the streets in the little areas and provide technical assistance for the housing they have. So it's a different culture, maybe in our slums, our favelas. And my question for you, I think this may be very interesting for a foreigner and a sociologist such as yourself. And I want to hear your perspective, what you think of this communing air that kind of you kind of breathe in Paraisópolis, and how this might affect the action, the work of architectures. They are always concerned and worried about the possibilities of interventions. They want to do something that is not top-down.
I'm not sure to understand quite well your question, Anis. What am I thinking about the possibility of intervention in this neighborhood? That was your question? Yeah. Yeah, well, that's a huge question, and I'm not sure I can answer that. And you, for sure, you know these neighborhoods better than me, so I'm not taking the risk to give you an answer about that. It's a huge question, I think. But what I think when I visit this neighborhood here in São Paulo or in Brazil, even if, once again, it's really not the same problem in France, the problem is not really architecture or urban spaces. The problem is inequalities. And we have the same problem in France, I mean, because people in the neighborhood, in the suburb of Paris, in the north of Paris, which is where the poorest neighborhoods are, of course, there are problems of architecture because the building needs to be renewed and so on. But the first problem is the problem of inequalities. These people don't have access to a good job. They don't have access to a good education. They often don't have access to a good health system, and they don't have access to culture. So to me, the problem is not a spatial problem. It's a social problem. Maybe it's a way to avoid the question, but I think I'm not able to answer. No, I'm not an architect. So it's a sociologist's point of view. And probably my architect colleagues are not don't agree with me.
Nádia, outra vez?
Eu acho que isso é uma questão.
I think this is an important matter when we talk about social inequality. And the first examples that Sabrina brought to us showed that housing is not just a place to live. There was a urbanistic dimension in housing. And I think this is important. It can't be lost. We have to understand that. And also, Carlos Leite is launching a book about social urbanism. You know that. In 2017, when I talked about social urbanism, the group really liked about the concept. And here we compare and contrast the corporative urban in detriment of social urbanism. And I would like to ask Sabrina if one of the students here yesterday was defending a thesis, a master's thesis, which I'm very proud of having been the advisor, about a feminist urbanism. So I'd like to ask you if the leaderships that don't want to be leaderships because the management is horizontal and that's why they don't want to be leadership, they understand this horizontalization of management. Is there anything that, well, there's something that yesterday we found as urban sorority. So a space, a square, that by public administration ended up being destroyed, not by the traffic, but by public management. But you know, a built of a square, co-participation, that she denominated urban sisterhood or sorority. That's correct. So, I'd like to ask if a PRI or in one of those organizations, because a PRI has had 10 years, right, Karina? If they have this kind of construction building of public spaces with housing that has this perspective of a little bit of what Renata asked, a feminine brand and the building of a public space of a feminine urbanism. Is it something that we have here only? Or over there you have that predominance? Carlos brought that perspective about women being there because men, they just abandon their households in a general way. So women stay and they build space. Do you have anything similar in France that you guys are studying? If you don't have, okay, you don't have to.
I mean, experiences of urbanism in favor of women emancipation. Well, I'm not a specialist of the question, but not in France, in Europe and in Northern Europe, there are different initiatives, very top-down initiative by some cities. I think of the cities of Umeå in Sweden, with a strong policy of feminist urbanism, but I'm not sure of the real effect of this policy, so I cannot answer. And in France, we have more and more projects, again, top-down projects, so initiated by the institution, the local authorities, or sometimes the social landlords, addressed to women. But again, I'm not sure of the effect. There is I would say there is an intention, but for the moment, the results are not very efficient. Or I haven't heard of experience that's changed things really. So that I cannot answer more, but I would say that yes, we have more and more projects who intend to make a bigger place or a safer place, I don't know how to say that, to women, but still few in number and with not really effect that we can measure for the moment. But there is something very positive to me that in our school, we have more and more students interested by this kind of issue and gender issue in architecture, but much more in an urban scale. And we have more and more master theses about this kind of issues. So I hope it's going to change.
Bem,
Well, Sabrina, thank you for your words. Your reflection planted seeds that will germinate in our minds throughout thesis, activism, and resistance. Each one will handle this subject according to their hearts. So, thank you very much. Thank you, Maria Isabel, Nadia. Thank you, the audience. Good night, everyone. Thanks, everyone, the interpreters, everyone supporting in this event.
Let's rest now.
Yes.